Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Books and Mortar with me, your host Razia, where we talk about the books that build us. So this episode is about a very rare book called Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and it's written by Susanna Clarke. So this is a book that I started a few years ago, but I didn't finish it at the time. I really didn't get very far. I think I must have read like just the first chapter, if even. It was too slow for me, and I found it very difficult to read. But I decided to pick it up again recently because I've been constantly seeing a lot of good reviews on Instagram, and it's been on a few best fantasy books lists as well. So I thought, maybe I'm missing out on something here, so my FOMO made me pick it up, right? So I'm really glad, though, that I did it because I enjoyed it. And I don't know, maybe in my older age, I just have more patience with these things now. It's also the type of language that's used. It's kind of like Old English, and it's based in the 19th century. So, yeah, I suppose you can imagine from that. So 19th century England. So you can imagine what the English is like. It does take a little bit of getting used to when you start reading it, but I think if you're determined, you can do it. You can do it. Okay. So I'm going to be doing this review in two parts, honestly, just because the book is massive. It's over 800 pages long. It's split into 3 volumes, and each of them have about 22 chapters. The first volume is about Mr. Norrell. The second one is on Mr. Strange. And then the third one is about another magician named John Usglass. But honestly, after the first volume, the book focuses a lot more on Jonathan Strange than it does Mr. Norrell, which I think is pretty good because he's a much more interesting character than Mr. Norrell. So I have finished the book at the time that I'm recording this, but I'm just going to do the review in 2 parts. So there are some spoilers here, so please be aware. But I'm also only focusing on the main storyline here. There are a lot of side characters, and they also all have their own side plots. But I'm not going to go into all of that because then I probably have to do it in 3 episodes. Okay, so let me read the synopsis to you, right? It goes like this. The year is 1806. England is beleaguered by the long war with Napoleon, and centuries have passed since practical magicians faded into the nation's past. But scholars of this glorious history discover that one remains, the reclusive Mr. Norrell, whose displays of magic send a thrill through the country. Proceeding to London, he raises a beautiful woman from the dead and summons an army of ghostly ships to terrify the French. Yet the cautious, fussy Norrell is challenged by the emergence of another magician, the brilliant novice Jonathan Strange. Young, handsome, and daring, Strange is the very antithesis of Norrell. So begins a dangerous battle between these 2 great men, which overwhelms that between England and France. And their own obsessions and secret dabblings with the dark arts are going to cause more trouble than they can imagine. So that sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? When the book starts, England has a lot of magicians, right? But they're all theoretical magicians. They are not practical magicians. They don't believe that it is gentlemanly to actually do magic, but it's okay to study it. But a gentleman magician named Mr. Gilbert Norrell doesn't agree with this, and he's the only practical magician left in England at the time, and he has nothing but contempt for the theorists. So there are 2 of them in particular, Mr. Honeyfoot and Mr. Secundus, who travel to see Mr. Norrell, who lives in Yorkshire, because he's reported to own a library full of magic books, and they bring him to the attention of the Magic Society in England. So the theorists don't actually believe that Mr. Norrell can do magic, so they challenge him to a demonstration. And he tells them that in turn, if he performs the magic, then they must all agree to never study magic again and to stop calling themselves magicians. So all of them actually, except Mr. Secundus, sign this agreement, and Mr. Norrell performs his magic. So it's actually quite a spectacle, and it's even more impressive because he does it remotely. So he does it from Yorkshire, but it obviously has its impact in London, and I think that was actually more impressive. So this puts an end officially to all of England's magicians except one, Mr. Norrell. So technically 2 though, because Secundus didn't sign the agreement, but he's a theoretical magician, so he doesn't count. And you actually get the feeling while you're reading this, and Mr. Norrell wanted it this way. He doesn't want to share his knowledge. He wants to hoard all of the magical knowledge for himself, and he wants to be the country's sole magician. He's very arrogant about his abilities, and he's very suspicious of anyone else who takes an interest in magic, just in case they're a magician and they prove to be more adept than him, and also that if they contradict him and his beliefs and his opinions. So he moves from his home in Yorkshire to London, where he takes up residence with his manservant named Childermas, who has very serious Severus Snape vibes, by the way. So Mr. Norrell moved to London, because he wanted to gain the attention of the government to let him help the English war effort against France using magic. So Mr. Norrell is an extreme introvert, right? So you can imagine getting himself known in society was not an easy thing for him to do. He actually doesn't even want to leave the house. But there's a character named Drawlight who is apparently boasting all over town that he knows Mr. Norrell and that they are the best of friends, and he's promising everyone that he will convince him to appear at dinner parties and show them some magic. So Mr. Norrell actually happens to be at one of these parties, and he overhears Drawlight telling another gentleman this. And he's quite shocked, right? But that's actually how he makes a friend of Drawlight and his acquaintance, Mr. Lascelles, the two of whom are then able to introduce him to society in the hopes of making the type of connections that he's looking for. So Drawlight and Lascelles both have their own arcs in the book, but I'm not really going to go into those. You'll have to read the book to see what happens to them. So they actually also mentioned to him that they know another magician named Vinculus, who is a street magician, and he's also got a bit of a bigger role to play later on. So needless to say, Mr. Norrell doesn't really think much of him, and Vinculus holds all of the beliefs that Mr. Norrell doesn't, especially belief in a particular magician named the Raven King, or John Usclas, the first magician. So later on, Mr. Norrell comes to know that Vinculus is actually in possession of a magic book that once belonged to the Raven King himself and contains a prophecy about the return of magic to England and the two magicians who will bring this about. So he doesn't understand how this is possible because he's the only practical magician in existence in England at the moment. So despite his contempt for John Usclas or the Raven King, he's pretty determined to try and get his hands on this book. So he tries desperately, he interrogates all of Vinculus's wives, there are 5 of them, but to no avail. Eventually, though, to further his agenda, Mr. Norrell is able to call in some favors to meet a gentleman named Sir Walter Pole. So he's a minister in the cabinet, and then he tries to convince him that magic has a place in the war against France. So Sir Walter Pole is engaged to be married to a young lady named Miss Wintertown, and this lady is not at all well. I actually think that she had tuberculosis, to be honest, because of her symptoms. But I might just be biased because, I do work in TB. So it's an advantageous marriage for Walter because she's a lady of means. So, she just has to live until they get married, right? So it's not common, really, for a magician to volunteer to bring someone back from the dead. Based on her symptoms, I personally think she has tuberculosis, but I could be mistaken. So it's an advantageous marriage for Walter because she's a lady of means. But, of course, it would be a problem if she dies before they can get married. And this then actually becomes a problem because she passes away before they can actually get married. And then this is where Mr. Norrell comes in. So it's not common for a magician to volunteer to bring someone back from the dead. In fact, I kind of imagine that it's the stuff that they stay away from. And what happens is that Mr. Norrell has to summon a fairy to help him do it. So he's very determined then to be included in the war effort if he's willing to perform a resurrection and enlist the help of a fairy to do so because he has nothing but contempt for fairies. But he feels that if he does this for Sir Walter Pole, he would then, be in his favor, and then he would speak to cabinet about him and get him involved in the war effort. So the fairy he summons doesn't actually have a name, and he's just described as the gentleman with the thistledown hair. He helps Mr. Norrell to bring Miss Wintertown back to life in exchange for half of Miss Wintertown's life. So Mr. Norrell reasons this out, and he decides himself that it's not such a bad deal, and he agrees to this. So there's no one else in the room when this is happening. He's kicked everybody out, including Sir Walter Pole, and he's alone with the fairy. And he reasons it out that if she's 19, I think, at the time, and he figures that if she lives until the age of 90, then it's not bad if the fairy sort of takes half of those years because she would technically have another 70 years to live. And if he takes 35 of those, she'd still have 35 left. So he does the math and he feels, okay, fine, I'm okay with this. he's okay with it, which I felt was just really bad. But anyway, so while the fairy is talking to Mr. Norrell, he actually makes mention of another magician, right, who is a great friend of Mr. Norrell's. But of course, he has no idea who he's talking about because there's no other magicians in England. But now this is the second time that another magician is mentioned, right? The first time was in the prophecy. So anyway, they make the deal, and Miss Wintertown is resurrected. Yeah, it's a hard word to say. The very picture of health. But of course, the deal doesn't exactly take the form that Mr. Norrell anticipated, because just 2 or so years after her resurrection, the now Lady Pole is visited by this fairy gentleman with the thistledown hair, who feels that she lives a really awful life under her husband, Sir Walter Pole, and he figures that he's going to show her a better life by taking her to balls and dinners in a place called Lost Hope in Fairy every night. And this sends the poor lady into like this complete melancholy, saying she's always cold and she's tired and she absolutely despises balls and dancing. So naturally, if you're being forced to go to a ball and dance every night, you're probably going to get tired of it, right? The thing is, though, try as she might, she can't actually tell anyone what is afflicting her. Whenever she starts to tell the story, she ends up like spouting fairy lore and no one actually understands what she's talking about. And the same thing happens to Stephen, who is Sir Walter Pole's butler. The thistle-down-haired gentleman feels that Stephen is not acting at his proper station in life, and he takes it upon himself to elevate him where he wants it or not. So it seems as though he has good intentions, right? But he obviously just goes about it in a very wrong way. And I don't know, honestly, if his intentions are actually good or not, or if he is just malicious. I think that he's just malicious. I don't think that he really intends good for them or for anyone else, really. So I didn't really enjoy reading the arc about fairy with Stephen and Lady Pole. It was pretty creepy, right? And it wasn't connecting to the main storyline at this point. But it does eventually, of course. So the thistle-haired man wants to make Stephen the King of England because he believes that he possesses a beautiful character that is befitting to a king. And I agree with him, right? Stephen, I have to mention, his surname is Black, and I'm imagining that it's descriptive, right? Because Stephen is African, right? So he's a black man in England in the 19th century. So you can imagine what that's like for him. But Stephen is a bit unsure about, becoming King of England because, he doesn't want to. And he tries at every point to get the thistle-haired man to let Lady Pole go without any negotiation for himself, which I felt was really selfless of him. But he was never successful. So later on in the story, Arabella, who is Jonathan Strange's wife, attracts the attention of this thistle-haired man. And then she has lengthy conversations with him when she visits Lady Pole. So she's actually then his third victim. So anyway, Mr. Norrell gets his audience with the government finally, and he's included in the war effort. And he actually does some pretty cool things, because I think that they were really doubting him and of what benefit he would be. But he creates this illusion of boats out of rain, right, so that the French think that a British fleet is advancing on them. And he causes them to waste 11 days in port while the British are actually off elsewhere doing something else. And this is actually how he becomes an employed magician. I thought that was really clever. So Jonathan Strange is the other main character in the story. So he's the son of a man named Lawrence Strange. I feel like Jonathan Strange is actually the main character and Mr. Norrell is actually the supportive, because the story becomes about Jonathan eventually. So he was 4 years old when his mother died, and his father didn't really have much love for him. Shame, poor guy. So he spent half of every year with his late mother's family. Jonathan grew up to be the kind of man who never really committed to anything, though. He tried his hand at a lot of different occupations, but he couldn't seem to find one that occupied him for very long. So this is the description of him. Jonathan Strange was a very different sort of person from his father. He was not avaricious, he was not proud, he was not ill-tempered and disagreeable. But though he had no striking vices, his virtues were perhaps almost as hard to define. At the pleasure parties of Weymouth and in the drawing rooms of Bath, he was regularly declared to be the most charming man in the world by the fashionable people he met there. But all that they meant by this was that he talked well, danced well, and hunted and gambled as much as a gentleman should. In person, he was rather tall, and his figure was considered good. Some people thought him handsome, but this was not by any means the universal opinion. His face had two faults, a long nose and an ironic expression. It is also true that his hair had a reddish tinge, and as everybody knows, no one with red hair can ever truly be said to be handsome. So shame, poor guy. So he's not a very remarkable kind of person, right? He seems to be pretty average and just a generic gentleman. But after Lawrence Strange dies, Jonathan decides that he's going to marry a lady named Arabella Woodhope. So on his way to her residence to propose marriage, he encounters Vinculus, right, the street magician, who had been exiled from London at Mr. Norrell's request. So Vinculus tells him that he's the second magician that the prophecy is referring to, and that his fate has been decided long ago. So Jonathan is quite perplexed by this because he doesn't know any magic and he's not a magician. But I think this plants a seed in his mind, So after sitting with Arabella and her household, he determines that he's actually now going to become a magician. And he can't really explain why, but this is something that he wants to do now. So that's the thing about magic in this book, though, is that anyone can actually learn it if they want to. It's not something that you have to be born with. So he buys a few spells of Vinculus, and he actually gives them a try, one of them being one spell to discover what my enemy is doing presently. That is quite the name for a spell, right? So he finds this very odd because he doesn't actually have any enemies, but he gives it a try anyway. And the person he sees is Mr. Norrell, but he doesn't obviously know this at the time because he doesn't know Mr. Norrell. So Jonathan and Arabella get married and they move off to London and they make the acquaintance of our old friends Misters Honeyfoot and Secundus, who tell him that if he wants to become a magician, he should seek out Mr. Norrell and ask him to teach him. So when Mr. Norrell hears about Jonathan, he becomes pretty anxious because, he doesn't like to share his knowledge, but he says that he's willing to meet him. So when they do meet, it becomes apparent almost immediately that these two are not going to see eye to eye. Strange is much more open than Mr. Norrell. He's interested in a lot of different opinions, where Norrell is really just interested in his own. Also, Mr. Norrell is not at all keen to share his books. So he's left a lot of his books in his Yorkshire library. He didn't bring all of them with him to London because he's got several thousand volumes. So there's one passage in the book that actually made me laugh, right? Because it describes how Mr. Norrell feels about his books and sharing them with people. Strange waited, but Norrell continued to gaze at the book in his hand as though he were entirely at a loss at how to proceed. "Then you must give it to me, sir," said Strange gently. "Yes, indeed," said Mr. Norrell. He approached Strange cautiously and held the book out for several moments before suddenly tipping it up and off into Strange's hand with an odd gesture, as though it was not a book at all, but a small bird which clung to him and would on no account go to anyone else, so that he was obliged to trick it into leaving his hand. He was so intent upon this maneuver that fortunately he did not look up at Strange, who was trying not to laugh. Mr. Norrell remained a moment, looking wistfully at his book in another magician's hand. I can completely understand how Mr. Norrell feels, right? Because you don't know how another person is going to treat your books. What if they dog-ear it? Oh my goodness. So they need to be thoroughly vetted, right, before they can be allowed to touch your books. And even then, some of them may require supervision. So that's how Mr. Norrell felt. He didn't want anyone else to touch his books or read his books. But it's also, I think, because he didn't want anyone else to gain the knowledge. So, but Mr. Norrell eventually warms up to Jonathan and he really starts to enjoy having someone to talk to about magic. Because remember, there are no other practical magicians, and he banned all of the theorists from continuing their studies. So he starts to like Jonathan and he praises him endlessly to his friends. Strange realizes, though, that while Norrell has actually agreed to teach him, there are some things that he's willing to share and some things that he isn't. So he is a bit wary about their relationship. The problem, though, is that Norrell doesn't remember what he wants Jonathan to know and what he doesn't want him to know, so he tends to trip up sometimes. So Jonathan eventually decides to spend time with the British Army in Spain to help the war effort because he feels like he needs to challenge himself and his magical ability. So he's been studying with Norrell for a while now, right? But he didn't feel very welcome in the army, and they didn't really know what to do with him because they didn't really see how magic could be used in battle. But he spoke to some of them, and one person actually gave him really good advice, that if he wanted to know what he could do for them, he needed to understand what they needed. And in order to do that, he had to be on the ground amongst the soldiers and get to know them. And I thought this was really, really good advice, because often people try and manage situations from a distance and they don't actually understand what the needs of the people are. So he does exactly this, and he finds himself making friends with the soldiers and making himself useful to Duke Wellington. He realizes that he has to be super assertive with Duke Wellington and then prove his usefulness, because the Duke's not going to ask him to do something. He just has to show that his magic is useful to him. So while he's out with the army, Strange is really like coming into his own as a magician. He needs to think on his feet, and he needs to be inventive with his magic to adapt it to his situation. And this is really the beginning of a rift between himself and Mr. Norrell. Also, at this point where Strange is with the army, there are a lot of names that come up of characters, and it can get a little bit overwhelming, but you don't really need to like commit the names of these characters to memory, because while they do make small appearances later on, they're not like integral to the main storyline. So it can become a little bit much, but don't worry about it. So one of the turning points here, or one of the defining moments in Strange and Norrell's relationship, I think is when Strange publishes a review of a book, right, that was written by Lord Portishead, who is the editor of a newsletter called the Friends of English Magic, which is pretty much a periodical that is just filled with Norrell's opinions, right? So the funny thing, though, is that Strange helped Lord Portishead with the book. And some of the opinions were actually pushed by he himself. So he's actually reviewing a book that he wrote, which seems like rather a conflict of interest. But it's funny because he wrote like a seriously scathing review. So the major issue, though, between Strange and Norrell is John Usglas, or the Raven King, and his importance in the whole sphere of English magic. So Norrell refuses to believe in his existence, let alone his contribution to English magic, while Strange believes that it's actually Usglas's magic that they are currently doing, so how can he be ignored? So after the review is published, there's anticipation of like this awkward meeting between him and Norrell. But Jonathan decides that the best attitude to adopt is one of dignified moral superiority, softened by a moderate amount of apology. And I really loved that. So this is actually how their meeting goes. "You think that I am angry," said Mr. Norrell, "but I am not. You think I do not know why you have done what you have done, but I do. You think you have put all your heart into that writing and that everyone in England now understands you. What do they understand? Nothing. I understood you before you wrote a word." He paused, and his face worked as if he was struggling to say something that lay very deep inside him. "What you wrote for me alone." Strange opened his mouth to protest at the surprising conclusion, but upon consideration he realized it was probably true. So remember, there are no other magicians in England. So if Strange and Norrell write about magic, they are essentially just writing for each other, because nobody is really going to understand what they're writing about, or the context of their writings, or the context of their opinions, and where all of these theories and ideas come from. So Mr. Norrell is actually not wrong in saying that. And then he actually goes further to tell Jonathan that he agrees with him. It is Usglas's magic that they do. But because he believes that Usglas abandoned them a long time ago, and they won't be able to find him unless he wants to be found. He even confesses to Jonathan that he tried to conjure or summon John Usglas once, but he wasn't successful. So they argue about like some sightings of Usglas that have been reported through the years, but Norrell like refutes them as hearsay. And then he goes on to argue that no one even actually knows what John Usglas looked like, because there are no pictures of him. So yeah, you do wonder then about the legitimacy of the claims. But then even after meeting with Mr. Norrell, who actually says that he's more than willing to explore Jonathan's ideas and forgo his own opinions, but, while still withholding his books, Strange is actually pretty determined that he remain distant from Mr. Norrell because he doesn't want to be his student anymore. So Mr. Norrell goes ahead and he keeps an eye on him, but if you want to call a spade, like he just plain spies on him. But I think Jonathan knows, and I think it's because he misses him, Mr. Norrell really fears losing Jonathan as a companion because he's the only person he can talk to, and he's the only person who would challenge his ideas, and he's very fond of him. So this rift really upsets him a lot, right? And after the confrontation, Jonathan does kind of regret his decision, but of course, pride prevents him from going back. So he decides to move himself and his wife from London to their country house, because he says that there doesn't really seem to be any reason for him to stay in London if he's no longer going to be working with Norrell. So Arabella has at this point become quite good friends with Lady Pole. I think, as close as you can become to somebody with her demeanor. And Lady Pole's actually very sad to hear about her friend leaving. And it's after this particular meeting, right, that Arabella tells Jonathan about the thistle-haired man that she's been seeing and chatting to at the Pole residence. So she tells him that the gentleman told her that he's very happy that Jonathan is starting to take a closer interest in fairies, because he feels that you can't be a magician and not be interested in them. And also that she thinks that he must be a king of some sort, because he's told her all about his kingdoms and castles and mansions. So Jonathan becomes a bit suspicious at this point, and he asks Sir Walter Pole's staff about him. But they say that they have never actually seen such a man in the house before. So just to a note about the magic, right? The magic in this book is very scientific. It's at a point where magic has been lost in England for a really long time. And Norrell and Strange are like scientists who are putting spells together. So they add aspects from one school of thought and then they'll remove another. So they'll, take instruction from one magician and then instruction from another. They'll try and combine it. They'll add and subtract things to try and make the magic work for them at the time. So the magic is somewhat flexible, but it's not flashy at all, right? It's very understated. The way the book is written, nothing is flashy. It's almost like Tolkien-esque in its essence, So the book also makes use of footnotes, and some very long footnotes. So if you're not into that, I feel like you could actually just skip it, because it's not really going to affect your understanding of the main storyline. There are some amusing ones, but honestly, I don't really think that you would lose anything if you ignore them. So I started off reading all of them, but eventually it got a bit tiresome for me as well. So I don't read a lot of books with footnotes. I think the ones that I read most frequently is probably Terry Pratchett, The Discworld, because he also makes use of footnotes. And then J. Kristoff's Nevernight series, because that one also makes use of footnotes. But I do end up skipping them eventually, because I just feel like they become a bit tedious. So this is where I'm going to stop this review. Thanks for listening. This has been an episode of Books and Mortar with me, your host, Rizia, where we talk about the books that build us. Till next time. Bye.